morning again, ladies and gentlemen. Opening statement is where the lawyers outline what the issues are to try to narrow your focus so that you, as you listen to the evidence, can sort of figure out what is it that I really need to be paying attention to ultimately and why. All of the lawyers are going to agree on certain facts. July 10th, 2022, there was a homicide. We're all going to agree on that. Outside of the courthouse, people interchange the words homicide and murder. Within the courthouse, the medical examiner is going to tell you homicide and murder aren't the same thing. Homicide means that one person has died at the hands of another person. In order for the homicide to become a murder, that it can't be accidental, there's no self-defense. So they're not quite the same thing inside the courthouse, even though they're the same thing outside the courthouse. And there's not going to be any argument from any of the lawyers that July 10th, 2022, there was a homicide. We all ultimately agree on that. We also don't really have any doubt about what occurred because it's captured on QT video, and there are witnesses who stayed around and told the police officers what they knew, and they're going to come in and testify. And what they're going to testify to is going to be basically corroborated by the QT video. Mr. Coleman came in. It appears that he's getting air in his tire because he's by the air machine. A vehicle that appears to be a Mercedes pulls in next to him. One of the occupants gets out. There's a struggle, and the person that initially gets out of the vehicle that's struggling with Mr. Coleman ultimately shoots Mr. Coleman. So there's not going to be any disagreement ultimately about what happened. Who shot Mr. Coleman? Ultimately, I think the evidence is going to show Josiah Hughley shot Mr. Coleman. I think the evidence is going to show that. So why is David Booker sitting here? Well, David Booker's sitting here because he has a connection to a Mercedes, and a Mercedes was used as the getaway vehicle at QT. That's ultimately why he's sitting here. So that's going to bring you, in regards to Mr. David Booker, to the first issue. The first issue that you have to decide. Is the Mercedes at the QT the same Mercedes that David Booker is associated with a day and a half earlier at the Texaco in Atlanta? David Booker has a connection to the Mercedes that you see, that you saw in the opening statement where they have the tag. That Mercedes is found in about a 1 mile radius of the QT. Here's where we get to the magical language. The state says that Mercedes is fleeing. So he puts the Mercedes that you have the tag for at the QT, but no one else does. There's not going to be any QT video that you look at where you can look and see that's the tag. None of the witnesses at the QT say, hey, I saw the tag or I saw a piece of the tag. None of that's going to happen. So this Mercedes that's half a mile or a mile away, it's not the traffic camera at the corner where the QT is. The Mercedes that's captured at some distance from the QT, the state says that's the Mercedes. And then from the statement, that's the Mercedes, they go backwards and say, that's why David Booker's involved. There's no one that's going to testify to the tag of the Mercedes that you saw on the flock camera. No video is going to show the tag to that Mercedes, but my client is associated with that Mercedes, and I suspect you're going to see evidence that he was at a Texaco about a day and a half earlier with that Mercedes, and I suspect there's going to be some evidence that he may have put some insurance ultimately on that Mercedes. So that's the first issue. Is the Mercedes that my client is associated with, is that the same Mercedes that was actually inside of the QT? And fleeing language, which is a conclusion, is not the same thing, ladies and gentlemen, as evidence. The second issue that you're going to have to decide as to David Booker is, was David Booker present at the scene of the QT at the time of the shooting? There's no witness that's going to come here that was at the QT at the time that's going to point and say, I saw David Booker. That's David Booker. He was present at the QT at the time of the shooting. There's no witness that's going to testify to that. The QT video that you saw in opening, that's all you can see, some figures. Some figures. You can't tell if they're men or women. Some figures, clear what happens, but you can't see anyone's face. So there's no, slow it down, blow it up. You're never going to be able to see any face of anyone. So there's no video that's ultimately going to identify David Booker as being present at the scene of the QT. There's no fingerprint that's going to put him at the QT. There's no DNA evidence ultimately that's going to put him at the QT. He never admits to being at the QT. So we get back to, in terms of Mr. David Booker being present at the QT, we get into this fanciful new language, digital DNA, digital deoxyribonucleic acid. There's no such thing. That's just another made-up term. The prosecutor is hoping if you can buy into the digital DNA theory, that if my phone is in Tracy Drake's car, I'm in Tracy Drake's car. See, they can't put David Booker there at the QT, but his cell phone is pinging from an area that's around the QT, like the car is around. So we have a car and we have a cell phone that is associated with David Booker pinging in the area. And so the prosecutor says, that Mercedes is the Mercedes fleeing. The digital evidence is pinging, therefore it's Mr. David Booker. If you type in digital DNA, nothing comes back because it's a made-up term. It's just made up. But that's the second issue, the made-up issue. The second issue is, can the state put Mr. David Booker ultimately at the scene, at the QT at the time of the shooting? So the first issue, you've already got a conclusion that the state has made, that the Mercedes is fleeing. And now you've got this made-up magical language, digital DNA, as it relates to the second issue with Mr. David Booker being present or not present at the QT. The third issue, obviously, is the gang charges. You should already know why, in opening, my client on the video, that was actually longer than the QT video. You should be able to know that. He's hoping that he can prejudice you. The prosecutor's hoping that you'll look past his conclusions about fleeing and digital evidence and say he's not a good person. If you need to write that down, you can write it down. David Booker is not a good person. You're not here to decide that. You're here to decide if the state's evidence is enough for you to determine that David Booker is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It doesn't matter if he's guilty or not. I always tell jurors, it doesn't matter. I believe one of the good people in the world is Mother Teresa. If there's evidence that she has shoplifted something from Walmart, then you say guilty. You're not here to judge her. You can't tell me Mother Teresa's a bad person, but you can tell me that the state has proved her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt as to the shoplifting. We're not here to determine good or bad. We're here to determine if the evidence is enough. But we got to deal with the third issue, the 10 gang charges. Is Mr. Booker in a gang? I suspect the evidence is going to show that Mr. Booker's in a gang. I suspect the evidence is going to show Mr. Booker's not a good person. I'm not worrying about you liking Mr. Booker. I'm not worrying about that. I'm not going to be asking any questions to try to persuade you to like Mr. Booker. We don't need to leave this table. Is the evidence enough? Is the evidence enough? Whether Mr. Booker's in a gang or not, you still have to answer the second issue. Was Mr. Booker present at the QT, and what was his role for purposes of the gang charges? Did he participate in any type of criminal activity, robbery, theft, hijacking of a motor vehicle, in furtherance of increasing his status in the gang? So that's the third issue as it relates to David Booker. Issue number one is let's call it his Mercedes, even though you already know he doesn't own it. Is the Mercedes that he's insuring the same Mercedes that's at the QT? That's a big question mark. A big question mark. And I don't think the state's going to be able to provide you evidence to say, yes, conclusively it is. Number two, is there any credible evidence that David Booker was present? Not his phone, not his girlfriend's phone, but actually David Booker there at the QT during the time of the shooting. And then number three, if he was there, if we get that far, do we believe that he was there acting in some capacity to furtherance his status in the gang activity? It's a circumstantial case, ladies and gentlemen. We know what happened. We've got to try to figure out, after the shooter, did the other two gentlemen play any role in this whole thing? And that's why there's so many witnesses, and there's gonna be so much evidence, videos and things of that nature, because it is a circumstantial case. But I suspect that at the end of the case, there's not gonna be enough credible evidence to satisfy you. At the end of all of the evidence, after all the cross-examination, after you hear from the witnesses, after you see all the witnesses, I suspect that you're going to be left with some reasonable doubt as it relates to David Booker. And then I'm going to come back, and I'm going to ask you to find David Booker not guilty of all the charges. Remember, it won't matter that he's not a good person or that he's in a gang. If you don't believe, I'm not sure that's the Mercedes. How do we know he's there again? What? And I'm going to expect you then to follow your oath and find David Booker not guilty of all the charges. Thank you very much. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Clegg, do you have an opening on behalf of Mr. Collins?